we've been thinking of studying a little dance choreography to like keep you awake, wake you up in the middle, but we were too tired to do that, so you have to actually keep awake like this. So in this paper that I'm presenting today, we estimate the long-run effects of being admitted to a more elite university program with a particular focus on family formation outcomes. And we'll be presenting evidence from Chile in this. As all of you know, there's quite a lot of evidence on the effect of an additional year of schooling in the labor market in terms of own labor market earnings, but also looking at other outcomes, such as child quality, for example. So we have seen a paper using compulsory schooling age changes, for example. At the same time, there's relatively little evidence on the effects of education quality, okay? Which is surprising because the differences in educational in education quality can be quite huge. And in fact, probably a majority of countries feature relatively heterogeneous university or higher education systems, also lower education systems. But for example, in the US, if you're thinking about Ivy League universities on the one hand and kind of, community colleges or kind of state colleges on the other hand, you can see that there are huge differences in terms of, for example, the student population, so student ability, family background, etc. As I said, many more countries feature vertically differentiated systems like this. And so this raises the question whether, basically estimating just the return to an additional year of schooling or the effect of going to college or not is actually masking a lot of interesting heterogeneity behind this. And also the big differences that we see suggest that the effects to the returns to quality might actually be quite large. So there is, despite the fact that we have not so much evidence on this, there is quite a lot of interest. So if you look at the New York Times, they probably have like every other week they have an article, discussing whether parents should, pay the high tuition cost to send their kids to like a top private college, or whether, some state college is good as well. So there's really a big debate, on this. There is some evidence, there are some recent papers looking at, for example, academic outcomes such as college completion. There's some evidence on individuals' labor market earnings. There's basically, the evidence on kind of family formation outcomes is extremely scarce, and we basically know very little about the effects of education quality and whether this has effects, for example, in the marriage market or in terms of child outcomes. And I think the motivation here, at this conference, I think I need to motivate less why these outcomes are actually interesting, but just to go through this. So I think it's important and interesting both from an individual perspective, but also from a social perspective, because arguably, the decision whether to get married and whom to marry is arguably one of the most important decisions that we make in our lives, and also whether to have children is a pretty important decision. And so we would like to know whether basically our educational experience can affect these decisions, whether I marry, whom I marry, whether it has effects on my fertility, etc. Okay? And also, we will look at effects in terms of spouse and child quality, which we believe capture important aspects of the long-run effect of elite education on people's well-being. Okay, so these are kind of proxies for the long-run effect on people's well-being, at least for those who are married and have children. And also, so we're not looking here at kind of the macro implication, but at least I think our results suggest that the education experience can affect basically with whom I'm matching, and therefore there can be effects in terms of inequality or household inequality, not only through kind of an individual's own labor market earnings, but also through the way people are matching in the marriage market. And also, we show that elite education basically has a causal effect also on the children of these university applicants. And so we show basically one kind of causal channel behind the strong intergenerational persistence, in a range of outcomes that, has been an issue that has been, investigated quite thoroughly recently. So there's, now I think a lot of evidence that, this persistence exists and how this persistence behaves over time and across different regions, etc. But there's still not, less evidence on kind of what are the causal mechanisms behind this. And so I think, we will speak a little bit about this here in this paper. So what are the exact questions that we're aiming to address in the paper? So we're asking what is the effect of being admitted to a more elite university program? First of all, on university applicants' completed marriage and fertility decisions. And in terms of fertility decisions, we know whether people have a child, the number of children, and also the timing of the children. So these are things that we're going to look at here. In addition, we're going to look at whether there are effects in terms of who you are marrying, okay? In terms of spouse quality. And we have basically 3 measures of spouse quality, which I'm using here. So the first is basically the performance on the standardized university entrance test, which kind of is a measure of academic ability of the spouse. We have evidence on university admission results of the spouse, so whether the spouse was admitted to university and to which type, to whether he or she was admitted to a top university or not. And we even have some evidence on kind of spouse's family background. Okay, so on whether you marry a spouse who comes from a more privileged background, for example. And lastly, the last kind of outcome we are interested in is whether there are intergenerational effects, so whether kind of, whether you are admitted to a more elite university program or not, whether this has actually effects that are transmitted to the next generation, so to the applicant's children. And there we're using, again, performance on standardized tests. Uh-huh. Mm-hmm. If it's also due to the pool of people that you mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So this is something that, in addition, we will provide some evidence or try to, look a little bit at the mechanism. So it's basically, what you're saying, I think. And so one thing we observe is basically whether the spouse went, for example, to the same university, to the same program. So we can, provide a little bit of evidence on that. And I will also tell you, once I show you the results, I will also argue that, in fact, this seems to be, part of the story, but clearly not all. So it's not so many people who are actually marrying someone from their same university or from their same program. And also, the effects don't seem to be driven through kind of, having higher labor market earnings and becoming more attractive because of these higher labor market earnings. But I'll show you the results, and then we can talk more about this. And lastly, we'll provide some evidence on the mechanisms behind the observed intergenerational effects. In particular, we have some direct data on investments into the children. Okay? So we can look at basically what's the causal effect of admission to a more elite university program on how much you invest into the child, and thereby basically, learn a little bit. So we'll discuss about it, but we learn a little bit about the role of kind of, resources in terms of the intergenerational transmission versus kind of, genetic endowment of the spouse, for example. So I'll talk more about this.
So mm-hmm. You're using the word admitted, not enrolled. Is that purpose?
Yes, that's on purpose. I'll show you exactly the kind of experiment that we're doing. But it's going to be basically an intention to treat effect, so whether you're admitted to the university or not, exactly.
But usually it's like a combination of places you get admitted to.
So here the system is different. So this is not going to be to the yes, and it's exactly one advantage of this system, where we have kind of where we use the system to have a clean identification using kind of a regression discontinuity design. Okay. Okay, so as I was saying, there's pretty little evidence on these outcomes, even though, arguably they are interesting. Why is that? Well, there are I'd say two important challenges in this encounter. One is data availability, and the other one is actual identification of the effect of, going to more elite universities, since obviously, the people who go to elite universities are different from the others, right? So it's a well-known problem. In terms of data availability, the outcomes that we'll want to look at it are pretty long-run outcomes. So either I kind of have a panel where I can follow people, after university, basically for 20, 25 years, to actually observe their, their marriage and their fertility decisions, or I need to be able to somehow match basically university applicants to their spouses and their children later on, right? Which is generally quite difficult. And three, I need to have some, quality measures, okay? Which is also not always available. So let me say right away. So the context that we are using is going to be Chile, which is, helps us to basically address both obstacles. In terms of data availability, there's basically archival data on university applications where we can go back basically to the beginning of the 90s, and we basically went into the archives there. So we have digitized data from basically 2000 on, but because we wanted to actually observe people's completed marriage and fertility, decision pretty much, we had to go back further, and so we observed these people basically when they're on average around age 42. Okay, where we will show they have pretty much completed their fertility, and also they have reached basically the marriage rate that they will reach. Mm-hmm.
I'm a bit confused about the notion of elite university.
Mm-hmm.
We have, suppose we have a ranking of universities,
mm-hmm.
and we look at the assignment in the marriage market,
mm-hmm.
and suppose we just throw away the top.
Mm-hmm.
Will anything change?
You mean if I look at the bottom without taking?
Is it just the issue of ranking, or is the elite also give you some added value?
We can do the same thing without the elite. So I'll show you exactly what we do here, and we've done the same thing basically without the elite using all applications, and we get qualitatively very similar results. So
the ranking is the issue, no?
Right, so I'll show you the ranking. The ranking is pretty stable, so I'd say it's pretty clear what are kind of the top universities, but I'll show you this, and I'll show you exactly what is also the treatment here. So what exactly are we looking at? Okay, and then we can talk more about it. Okay, so in addition, we managed to convince basically the Chilean authorities to merge our data on university applicants with data on their spouses and on their children. And in terms of quality measures, I was mentioning which we can use. So one nice thing is that there is basically a national university entrance test, which provides kind of a standardized test score measure for the spouse, for the measuring the a proxy for the academic ability of the spouse. We know where the spouse was admitted. And also for the children, fortunately for us, Chile is quite obsessed with standardized testing. So, also in terms of schools, they do this sort of, standardized test regularly. So we have these sort of measures for the children. And in terms of identification, so, as I mentioned, there's this well-known problem, and, the Chilean university admission system allows us to basically address this problem with a regression discontinuity design. And let me tell you kind of how the system works, and then we can, talk exactly about, how we are making use of this to identify the effect of interest. So the key interesting feature of this system is that basically there's a centralized admission procedure to all the traditional universities in Chile, which is the very large majority of universities, including both public and private universities. So all important universities are in there. In particular, beginning of the 90s, there were just a handful of basically private universities which just started, which are not in there, but the majority is in the system. Then all applicants take a university entrance test, the so-called PSU test. They submit applications to the central authority in Chile, which means that they are listing up to 8 university degree program combinations, ordered according to their preferences. And then the central authority uses this preference list plus the admission score to basically allocate people. Okay? And in particular, so they use a Gauss-Shapley mechanism to allocate people to university programs, basically assigning people to their most preferred program for which they are good enough. Okay, so they would start with like the person with the highest test score, admit him to his first choice, you know, the second person to his first choice, etc., until like some program is full, and then they get to the second choice and so on. And in that case, they will be waitlisted for their first choice program, okay, and appear on the waitlist there. So let me show you kind of you know, just a little bit to give you an idea of the Chilean university system. So probably most of you might know kind of the two top most elite universities in Chile, the PUC, the Catholic University, and the Universidad de Chile. Okay, and these two basically have been always the top two. They are just, you know, way above all the other universities in terms of quality. So more than half of their students are, you know, in the 90th percentile of the test score. Then you see, you know, kind of a, let's say, second tier, you know, universities with smaller fractions. And if you go further, so I had to cut this down here, but, you know, there you don't see much difference anymore between kind of the lower end. Okay, so which is one reason why we're focusing here on the you know, more top universities. But I show you exactly what we'll do, and then, as I said, we did the whole, you know, analysis also for basically all universities as well. Okay, so what is the exact treatment that we are analyzing here? So what we're looking at is basically what is the effect of just having been admitted to the more preferred and more selective university program. So what is the effect that I was just above the cutoff to this program, which I prefer more and which is more selective in terms of cutoff, versus basically missing this cutoff and falling into a less preferred, less selective program. Okay, so that's the comparison that we're going to do, and we're going to, you know, as in an RD design, we're going to focus on the people basically right above and below the cutoff. Mm-hmm. No.
It's just on test.
Yes, okay. Yes, exactly, yeah.
So when you make this comparison, the two people basically, they listed the same same program, so basically they listed A and B, and one got into A and one got into B?
So they both listed A as their preferred program, right? And one managed to get into A, and the other one basically fell into like a less preferred program B, which is also less selective. And what?
Not
yes.
A, not A.
So he missed the cutoff to A and falls into the next program B, right? So these are the.
But the person who got to A may have chosen a different program.
Right. So. Right, so we show that the preferences that they expressed in terms of the programs are the same for the people above and below the cutoff.
Right, so not
right?
the program.
So let's say, you know, so it's two people, they both list A over B. Yes. Okay, one has a score which is, you know, just above the cutoff, so he makes it into A, and the second person misses the cutoff and drops into B.
Right, but the B is the same for both applicants.
It's the same for both applicants. Yes. Yes, so we can show, so we could in principle also do this like program combination by program combination, yes. Right? So that's one way to do it. But what we can do is also we can show that, you know, the preferences that they had, you know, we can average over people, and we can show that the preferences they had over these programs were the same for the people just above and just below the program, below the cutoff. Sorry. Okay, yes.
But, you know, from the ranking that you showed, there's only really a big jump between the second and third, right? So A and B are very similar for most people.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Well, right. So you see a big quality. So this is a comparison in terms of universities. So in terms of university programs, there's more variation there. Okay. But it's true that, you know, what we're doing. So let me show you this. So what we're doing. Sorry, there's one part. So I'll get there. So there's one part which moved into the back. I'll show you exactly the empirical strategy, and then we can talk about this. Exactly. So here, so as I was saying, what we are comparing is always the more selective, more preferred versus the less selective, less preferred. as you mentioned, the big quality drop or the big quality differences appear to be more towards the upper end of the quality distribution, right? Which is one reason why we're focusing here on basically, the upper end of the quality distribution and check whether, for people who apply to some program within these universities, being admitted there to the more, more preferred, more selective versus less preferred, less selective, what is the effect there? But we, in the earlier paper, we used basically all application and we can show the same thing. But it's true that there we are going to include basically, cases where basically the program they fall into is basically, very similar to the program they preferred in terms of the peer quality and all these sort of things, right? We're just averaging in basically cases where the quality difference is tiny, right? Mm-hmm.
Chile, do you have can you transfer if you're very good in from your school?
So
in the US, for instance, people can move into that from the community.
So as far as I know, they have to basically reapply again. So you see people reapplying. So if they, if they are admitted somewhere and then either this wasn't what they liked or they want to, transfer, they would have to reapply and then, then they might get into their more preferred program. Okay.
Using the same grades that they using the same score that they don't have to retake the test.
I think they don't have to retake the test. So they could retake the test, but I think they don't have to. So there's one thing that, in principle, you might be worried. So in our strategy, what is key is, of course, that the person, just above the cutoff versus just below is the same in terms of their characteristics, right, in terms of their preferences, etc. So if you have people who are kind of retaking, doing the test again in order to just get above the cutoff, right, you might kind of generate a selection in there. So what we do is basically use first-time applications. Okay, so we exclude anyone, reapplying. We just look at first-time applications. Okay, and then we can show that, in terms of all characteristics and preferences over programs, etc., they are balanced, above and below the cutoff.
Maybe you talk about this, but in the data, when you look at the data, the variation in rankings is coming from our students ranking different programs, or are they choosing different universities but the same program?
Both. So it's a combination of both. It's a combination of both. So we are using we are using the combination of both. So your preferred university program versus your less preferred university program, which includes cases where it's the same university and cases where it's a different university, but the same, different university, but the same program and the other way around. So it's a combination of the two. Okay? We can talk more about the, so you were talking about the major choice, and I can kind of tell you later kind of why I think this is I think most of the action here is not coming through the major, but more through the selectivity, and also why I think here in this context it's actually cleaner to do it in the way we are doing it. Okay, but we can talk more about this later. Okay, so let me tell you a little bit more about the data, and then I get to the details of the empirical strategy, and we can talk more about how exactly we are doing this. So as I was saying, the first thing we did was to digitize basically, archives on university applicants applying in the early 90s. So for 4 cohorts between 1990 to 1993, which we observed on average at age 42, where about 70% or 71% of them are married, and the marriage rate goes to at most about 73% or so. Okay, so we basically have them kind of with a completed marriage history, and also the fertility history stops, in particular for women, it actually stops more around age 39. Okay? We observe their scores and also to which university program they have been admitted or waitlisted. Then we know whether they got married, and we know their spouse's scores and their spouse's admission results. Okay? In particular, we digitize not only this data, but also basically, in part data was available starting from 2001. It's digitally available, but we also digitize basically, all those other cohorts to have, so that the spouse could have taken the test or could have applied to the university anytime between 1989 and 2006. Okay. And I was saying, so I can show you some results also on people's family background. Unfortunately, we don't have data on family background for these old or early cohorts, okay? Because, so this survey data, this is basically survey data which is only available starting in 2001. Okay, I'll show you some kind of results on this as well because I think it's quite interesting, but this is basically for people who are, you know, beginning mid-30s. Also there, kind of a majority has gotten married at that point, but you know, it's different cohorts, just to tell you this. Alrighty. So in addition, we know basically the timing and the number of children. We know test scores, basically math scores and verbal scores that children have, you know, how children have performed on this standardized test called CEAR-HCEO. And in addition, we have some data on child investment, okay, which is which type of school children attended, so in particular whether it's private or public, how good the peers are in this school, so also, you know, measure of kind of school quality if you want, and also the socioeconomic composition of the school. Okay, and in Chile, it's, you know, I'd say, you know, it's a system in some sense similar to the U.S., where people spend a lot of money, you know, on kind of their children's education to get them into the top schools, or, you know, which are mostly the private schools. So I'd say one of the main monetary ways to invest into the kids is really their school. Okay, and so this is kind of the information we have.
Do you have any information on whether the students drop out? I mean,
we don't have information on dropout. Because that's basically, until very recently, this was information that only the universities had. So this was not information that was collected centrally, on a central level, but this is information that the universities had. So we would basically have to go to each university separately to kind of collect this sort of information.
So you wouldn't know whether they graduated from that?
We wouldn't know whether they graduated. No. No. We know whether they're admitted to there, and you know, there's a pretty strong correlation that they're actually going there where they were admitted, but we don't know when they dropped out, for example. So that would be an interesting outcome, I think, to look at, for example, if women, you know, or men, you know, found a spouse and then they might drop out afterwards or something, but that's not something we know.
Now, what's the dropout rate? What's the graduation rate of these people at universities? Do you know the graduation rate?
Not 90%, so it's lower than that. The point is, I mean, the effect that we're interested in, you know, is an effect that could come just from going there for 1 year. No, in principle, you can go there for 1 year, you know, meet your spouse, and then, you know, drop out or complete. You know, it's something that is interesting, I think, but it's not, you know, it's not necessary to you know, to have that for the outcomes we're looking at. So it might be interesting as a channel, right, to kind of learn more about this, but you know, we don't know that. Yeah.
So about the children's schooling, so is it also test-based, or? It's
a standardized test also.
Admission.
Yeah. It's not an admission test. No, it's not an admission test. So it's basically a test that I think it's mostly for schools to see, you know, to evaluate schools, how well schools are doing. It's not an admission test. Yeah. Okay. So I explained to you kind of how the allocation to university programs works. And as I was saying, so in our case, it's not that we just have one cutoff, right? But we actually have many different cutoffs, right? Between many different kind of universities and university programs over 4 different years. And so in most of the results, to have a lot of power, we make use of, we basically aggregate, you know, all these different cutoffs. Okay, and how do we do this? Well, we normalize basically for each program the score of the admitted and waitlisted people, subtracting the program cutoff. Okay, so this means that, you know, if you have a positive normalized score, you were admitted to the more preferred, more selective program. If you have a negative score, you were not admitted, right? So let me show you one kind of graph to give you an idea of this. So basically here, just as an example, I'm looking at the effect on basically child quality for women. Okay, so this is the left panel is for children's verbal score, the right panel is for children's math score. And here you see this line is the 0, so anyone with a positive score, you know, is to the right of the 0, was admitted to the more preferred, to the, you know, higher ranked university program. with a negative score, you were not admitted. Okay, you were waitlisted basically. And what you see,
averaging across programs.
then we're averaging over programs, exactly.
Is there any interesting pattern by programs? Because this gap will tell you maybe for some programs.
That's true. So you could look at heterogeneity, right, over the ability distribution, these sort of things. So we did this more. So in the other paper, we showed, for example, that there are big gaps where you see, so bigger effects where you see big quality differences, for example, in terms of the peers, right? So you could see that there's a strong correlation there. Where you have big quality jumps, basically the effects are particularly strong, right? So there are different dimensions you could look at. Mm-hmm.
Just to clarify, so you're averaging across program, but elite is in the top 2, or it's or you're
elite. So we're talking elite is in this context the higher ranked, so the more selective, more preferred.
So at the individual level.
Yes, exactly, right. So it's so which is tendentially, which is, so you're looking at so it might be that you're falling out of the top, right? Or it also includes the cases where you're falling from number 1 to number 2, for example. Okay, it's an average over both.
Students know they will not have a very good score. You may also have students quite at the bottom, right?
Mm-hmm.
Where you have where elite is not really elite.
Right. Right. So that's why we're focusing here on people who are applying to any of the top 5 universities. Okay. So yes, to take this into account. I prefer to stand down there to have a better view. So what is the strategy? I think is pretty clear and well known to everyone. So why are the outcomes of interest that we're looking at, such as marriage and fertility behavior and spouse and child, outcomes? The key kind of, the effect is captured by this beta, basically whether, your normalized score is above the 0 so that, you were admitted to the more elite or to the higher ranked university program, okay? Controlling in general, so the problem is that generally, in particular, if you have just one cutoff, you need to, in order to kind of get statistical significance, you need to take people also further away from the cutoff, right? Which is why generally you would, have to kind of control for the individual's own score because, the further away you are from the cutoff, the more these people become different from each other. Now, the thing is that, because we have so many different cutoffs, we have a lot of power to actually go as close as to the last observation above and below the cutoff. Okay, so we can quite literally take basically the two closest observation, the one just above and the one just below, and I'll show you results on that. Okay, I'll show you results on kind of using a pretty small window and using this linear specification. We also check robustness using a quadratic. You get very similar effects, and then I'll show you results using just really the closest individual on either side of the cutoff, and making sure that they are really close. Okay, so there might be a program where the closest is far, and then we drop this program. So we only take those that are really close to each other. Okay, so let me kind of get to the results. So the first set of results are the marriage and fertility decisions. Yes, sorry.
It's again a repeated question which I didn't understand. So if I rank two students rank 1, the top school 1,
mm-hmm.
you're comparing one gets and one doesn't.
Mm-hmm.
The second ranking has to be the same program, or
so the second ranking is going to be the same on average, and we show this.
It's not the same program.
But it's going to be a mixture, right, of people who, let's say, put number 1 as the first choice,
right.
and then maybe University 4 as the second.
Right.
And there are also going to be ones that have 1 and 2.
Right. But yes, that's right.
2, there probably won't be much difference.
Uh-huh.
So you really identify.
No, but the point is, what matters is whether the people above and below the cutoff rank these programs differently. Okay.
On average, they won't.
On average, they won't. Exactly. Right. And that's key.
But
right.
So let's say you have that mixture of these people, and then the ones who are really, they're going to get into their preferred one, but the next runner-up is almost as good.
Mm-hmm.
So you won't find any effects for that.
Right.
So you're basically going to find the effects of the people who, for some reason, their second alternative or their one that they got into was really quite different from the one they just.
It's an average of the two effects.
Right.
It's an average over these effects. Exactly. It's an average over those effects.
So
yes.
whatever you get, it's going to be of that second group.
it's an average over those. No, it's an average over those. Why is it? It's not just for this group. It's exactly an average over those, right?
Well,
so one might have a 0 effect, the other one might have a big effect, and I'm averaging for all of them. No, I'm exactly not trying. So I could condition on preferences, right? I could do this and also do this for different preference group, right? But I think here, I think the average, looking at this for all individuals independently of their preferences is, is also, is one interesting way to look at this.
Can I guess related, but let's look at the number 1 and number 2 school.
Okay?
So I applied to number 1 school because my girlfriend is also going to number 1 school, so I put number 1 and number 2 second. But somebody else puts 2 first because his girlfriend is going to number 2 school and puts number 1 second. Now, could we both be marginal, or is only one of us could be marginal?
So the guy,
the same score. If
right?
the same score, will we both be marginal, or we both?
No.
One of us
So the second guy, right, who is listing the number 1 below, will never fall into number 1 because it has a higher cutoff. Okay. So the thing is, if you're,
I can only be marginal, even though I can only be marginal in 1 school.
You can, right, exactly. You cannot go into the opposite direction. Okay, so you could, but you wouldn't fall into this, right? You wouldn't fall into this sort of direction. Exactly. So that's why the comparison we do is always more preferred and more selective versus less preferred, less selective, because you're not falling into a more selective program, right? If you miss the cutoff to the more selective one, to the less selective one, you're certainly not going to fall into the more selective one. Right? So it's always this sort of comparison. But over all individuals, right? It's just that they fall then into like his third option. Okay. Let me.
So you were saying that people can apply many times. So here you're only comparing the first shot.
Here we're comparing the first application.
Information for people that didn't make it the first shot. How likely they are to make it eventually?
Into their first choice, you mean? I'm not sure. So it's there are reapplications, but it's not like a huge fraction. It's something like I think 15%, 20% or so where people reapply. Okay, but the thing is we don't care about those. So what I count you as, if I didn't make it into your preferred program, I count you as having not being admitted to the preferred program.
Would be if they all make it eventually.
Well, then I should not find anything, right? Then I should not find anything because I'm counting them. I'm counting them into the less preferred program. If they actually get into the great program afterwards, I count them as being in the less preferred program. So I'm basically, I shouldn't find any effect. No. So it could be an underestimate of the effect. Let me show you. So what are the effects in terms of marriage and fertility? Ex ante, it's actually not clear, right? So if I'm admitted to the more elite program, I'm facing suddenly, a group of peers who are very smart, more smarter and more privileged, right? So I might, maybe like to marry them more, right? On the other hand, I might also, become more picky, given that, I'm now in a great, in this sort of great context, and increase my kind of threshold, my reservation quality. Plus, it's a question also whether they want me, right? Because, as the person who just made it in. Okay? And so when we look at that, what we find is actually, so I told you for robustness, I show you these different windows, okay? And so the small windows are actually the last observation just above and below the cutoff in very small kind of windows around the cutoff. So what you see is consistently, there's no effect of being admitted to a more elite university program on the likelihood of being married. Okay, so around 71% of these guys are married, no matter where they are admitted. Okay, now, condition on marriage, there's also no effect on having a child. Okay, 90% of these guys have children, and this is not affected by whether they were admitted to the more elite university program or not. There's no effect on the number of children, and there's also no effect on the age of first birth. Okay, so no effects in terms of these decisions, which at the beginning we were a bit disappointed, but actually, for the second part of looking at the quality, is actually nice because I have the same likelihood of being married above and below, so I can actually compare the spouses in terms of their quality. Okay, so let me show you the results in terms of spouse quality. So the first outcome we're looking at is the test score. Okay. Yes.
You also have singles in the data, people who do not marry.
In principle, yes. Mm-hmm. Yes.
There is an argument going on in the literature that men don't want to marry women who are more educated than they are.
Mm-hmm.
One aspect of that is it's simply possible that those women who are too educated
Right.
will remain single.
Right. Now, the thing is, there might be this effect when I compare college versus no college, for example. But looking at these differences, if I'm admitted to the slightly more preferred, more selective programs versus the kind of second best, there's no effect here. So we don't find any effect there in terms of this sort of quality margin. Okay. Instead, in terms of spouse quality, so first we look at test scores, and what you see is pretty strong and robust effects there for women who are admitted to the more elite university program. Okay? So they have spouses who perform substantially better in terms of math scores. So the magnitude here is about 20% of a standard deviation. Okay? So it's pretty big effects in terms of verbal score. It's about 15% of a standard deviation. Okay? So these women really get spouses who are performing quite a bit better in terms of test scores. For men, we really find, robustly, basically zero effect in terms of this dimension. Okay, so in terms of test score, we don't find an effect.
Can you tell whether the 27 is the difference in average test scores between the first and the second program?
It's smaller than that. So we have looked at.
What is smaller?
So this effect here is smaller than the average peer quality difference.
Oh, it's smaller than
it's a bit smaller than the average peer quality difference. Yes, yes, but it's relatively, so it's not much smaller than that. So the peer quality difference, I think, is about 35 for the math and like 25 or something for verbal.
So how are you interpreting this difference between men and women?
So let me show you the other outcomes, and then I get to the asymmetry. Okay.
When you talk about marriage, is being married at that time or
having ever married? Yes, having ever gotten married. Yes. So then we look at university admission. So there's no effect in terms of whether the spouse applied, but you do see pretty big effects in terms of having a spouse who went to like a top university. Okay, so the women again are more likely to have a husband from a top 2, 3, 5, university. For men again, you see pretty much zero effects.
Is the ranking the same for
You mean whether the admission works in the same?
Yeah.
There are no quotas. It's exact same for men and women.
Well, but
yes.
they might apply to different programs.
They might apply to different programs. Yes. It's similar. So we have computed like the peer quality differences also in terms of like peers of opposite sex, which would be kind of the potential spouse, and you see a relatively similar effect. So there's not a big difference there. So let me kind of show you the other results, and then. Sorry. So they are not listing exactly the same type of programs.
I would look at the gender ratio in the programs, because if men get into engineering programs and it's a top program, then they're not meeting spouses. But if women get into top programs, they might meet spouses.
Right. I'll show you that very few actually in total meet their spouse there. So I don't think it's an important channel anyways, but yes, we could look at that. So I'll show you that result as well. So let me just show you the last result, family background. Okay, so here I have women, in the first part, men in the second part. This is for the younger cohorts, okay, just because I think it's an interesting result as well. So also what we see here is that women admitted to the more elite university are more likely to have a spouse, to have a husband whose mother is college educated, okay, whose mother is in the labor force, and whose father is in kind of a higher ranked occupation. Okay, so as a woman, being admitted to a more elite university program also has effects in terms of spouse's family background. Okay? Again, for men, we see pretty much nothing. Okay? Now, I don't know if we want to talk later about the asymmetry or if you want to see the child quality results. So I can just say very quickly. So we've tried a little bit to see whether we can kind of get a simplified model to generate this sort of asymmetry. And so one important thing that you need is basically that men and women differentially prefer different traits in the spouse. Okay, so in particular, what you need is that women prefer or are looking particular into the ability and the education and the family background of the husband, okay, while men appear to be looking at something else, like, for example, physically appearance. Okay, so if you have this sort of, differential trade-offs, which actually has been shown in the, in the speed dating literature, for example, you see this sort of trade-offs, like Fishman has a paper on this. They show that, women are more interested in kind of social status, ability, and these sort of things. Men, kind of more into the physical appearance, and then you could generate effects like this with kind of a very simplified model.
Effects by looking at different majors, by sex ratios. Because, I mean, suppose you have a woman in an engineering field.
Right.
So
So
options are.
So let me show you. There are very few people who are actually marrying someone from their program. Okay, so I don't think that is kind of a key factor. And these numbers, so they are like less than 10% of people marry someone from the same program. And here this means they ever went to the same program. So they don't even have to overlap. Okay, I should look at it. But so that's why I think it's not kind of a major channel. Okay, so this sort of meeting place thing. So.
Just a question on the asymmetry in the table where you were looking at the spouse quality measured by the top school. So mechanically, it must be that if these women are marrying these top university men, that more men also should be marrying top university women, right? So
it's not a closed system, right? First of all, so some of them marry outside. Okay, so some of them marry. There's quite a big age gap, so they are not marrying kind of people of the same cohort. So you can generate something like this. So we can talk a bit about the model that we have looked at, but you can kind of generate some asymmetry there in terms of the return. So let me just very quickly show you the child outcomes. So as I was saying, we also look at whether there are intergenerational effects of the admission to the more elite university program, which can go through different channels. Okay, and I'll talk to you about the potential channels in a bit. But I think what is interesting is when we look at the effects on children's language and math score, we see effects both for male and female applicants, and we see actually pretty similar effects. Okay, so now for the spouse, the effects were quite asymmetric. For the children, we see pretty similar effects. Okay, which kind of suggests already that the channels might be quite different. Okay, and so in order to kind of provide some suggestive evidence on the role of different channels, we're using this sort of data that we have on kind of the school quality. Okay, so as kind of the investment into children's quality, and we look at that, to kind of see kind of to get an idea of the kind of this resource channel. Okay, remember the other channel, okay, is the higher quality spouse, which could be in principle, contributing to resources, but who is also contributing in principle through kind of genetic endowment, right? Because the spouse of the women, at least, were quite substantially better in terms of their scores. Okay, so this is evidence on kind of the school quality of the children. Okay, so we are now looking at the children of the applicant and kind of to which type of school they went. And so what you see here is kind of, the opposite of the spouse quality effect. So you see quite big effects for men in part. So men are more likely to send their kids to private schools or subsidized private schools. They're more likely to send their kids to schools, with high socioeconomic status peers. For the test scores, we don't have enough power to kind of say, to get something significant, but you do see that for women, they are tendentially, more on the negative side, for men on the positive side. And so, for women, there's really no evidence that there's any kind of resource effect there.
Yes, I was wondering, so how large will be the income effect for the parents? Okay, and does it differ?
Well, that would be nice. So we don't see the household income here, no. So we argue that it's actually nice to have I mean, it would be clearly nice to have that too. I think it's nice to have child investment directly because in principle, even if there was no resource effect, it might be that people, invest more because they are suddenly among peers who invest a lot, right? So, and that I couldn't capture with, just income, but with the child investment, I can get at that, right? And so basically, to conclude, so what do we find for male applicants? We find, relatively big effect still, even on their children. So there's an effect of about the magnitude of 10% of a standard deviation. We did find higher investment into the child. Okay, we found that the spouse did not have a higher test score. Okay, and the individual himself also did, by construction doesn't have a different test score, right? Because we are comparing the applicant, who are very similar in terms of their test scores. Okay, suggesting at least, that the resource effect, though they might be monetary or also informational in terms of knowing what are the good schools for the kids, it at least suggests that resources appear to be playing a role for men. Okay. For women, we found a very similar effect in terms of their test scores. We did not, and this is very robust, so we didn't find any effect in terms of investing more for female applicants. We did show that there was a pretty big effect in terms of, spouses' test score and, admission results and all these sort of things, which is, at least consistent with, kind of the effect in terms of genetic endowment contributing to kind of the intergenerational effect that we see for female applicants. Okay. I think I'm out of time, so I'm finishing. Yes.
So could this be these differences between man and woman? I mean, for women, passing this threshold is much more valuable because of discrimination or whatever. I mean, whereas for men, it's less of a signal. Hence, it doesn't matter. I don't know if you can get some sense of returns to this.
Right.
Better universities might be higher for women than men.
In principle, right. In principle, yes. Now the thing is that female labor force, the labor force participation of married women is much lower than that of men. Okay, so it's about 20 percentage points lower, which in Chile, but we saw actually something similar for the U.S. Okay. The other thing is that in principle, it could be that the woman who is admitted to the more elite university finds a higher earning partner and might actually, in principle, work less than the woman below, right? So in principle, you might have this sort of opposite effect of what you might expect, right, on the first hand. So I think that could be one explanation why maybe also the overall kind of resource effect is smaller for the woman than for the man. Okay?
So about the matching model, I think this is fascinating, but about the matching model, if men, when they get more income, don't choose a higher income spouse, you're saying it shows men don't value women's income, but if that's the case, I'm wondering how you get the effect that when women have more income, they match with a higher income spouse. Because if men don't value it, then it's not something you can trade on the marriage market to get a higher quality.
It's not clear that these women have higher income, right? So it's not.
They get whatever they get at university. I'm just saying whatever they get at university, if they can use, I don't see how they can use that to get a higher quality spouse if men don't want it.
Right. So social status might be one thing, right? They want. So independently of the women working, they might actually want a spouse who went to like a great university, but who is actually staying at home.
But they don't, because they don't go for higher scores, so they don't want.
It's arguing that he just wants a good-looking woman independent of her social status.
So what I was saying in terms of what people value, it's not something coming out. So I was saying that this sort of finding that people in the dating literature found when they said they didn't say men don't value social status, but they said when you compare appearance versus social status, women have kind of a higher preference towards the social status, and men kind of have a higher preference towards the appearance. Okay, in this relative link, that's what I'm saying has been found there. And in principle, that would be something with which we could rationalize kind of the asymmetric returns we find. So we wrote down a little model. We can talk more about it. Yes, thanks a lot. Thank you.